took this opportunity to introduce to you Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl, and the founder of the Usuli Institute, that I hope it's the voice that we need that represent Islamic movement and Islamic reality. I'm sure that it is, because he's a historian that looking for the truth in history and learning the lesson of history. He is a jurist, so he understands Sharia. He understands Islamic law and Islamic ethics and Islamic values. And the more I listened to him, I found that this is values not only for Muslims to pursue. It's probably suitable and very logical for humanity to adapt and to pursue. So before we talk to Khaled Abou El Fadl, I'd like to introduce Grace Abou El Fadl. She is the trusted wife and keeper of Dr. Khaled, and also she is the executive director of the Usuli Institute. She will tell you a little bit more about the purpose of the institute and what we are up to, and then we'll listen to Dr. Khaled. Thank you again for coming. Salam alaikum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anyone from here want to come? There's a lot of space over here too, so if you'll connected, if you're fine, that's fine. Thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your Saturday. I mean, everyone is extremely busy, and it's hard enough to find people who are willing to commit some time to improving their knowledge. So what we're going to talk about, I'd like to say a little bit about the Usuli Institute. We're going to talk about Sharia and Islamic law, and Sharia and Islamic law in America in particular. This is what we deal with. And I'd like to just ask and take a show of hands. How many people here think that Sharia and Islamic law are the same? Just a show of hands. Okay. And thank you. And how many people, if I were to call on you, would feel comfortable articulating what Sharia actually is?
What's the question again?
If I asked you, what is Sharia? Could you articulate what Sharia is? Could you explain what it is? And
well, as long as it agrees with what's given in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, it is acceptable as Sharia. So that's what Sharia is.
And let me ask this question. How many of you feel that Sharia is perhaps outdated and not relevant to our modern life here in America? Show of hands. Do you question what's the point of Sharia? And do you worry about your children and your grandchildren and what will remain of their Islam and their understanding of Sharia and Islamic law as they grow up and live and engage in the activities here in America? Is there anybody worried about their kids, their grandkids? Okay. This is the starting point of what we do. We have launched what we call with a shorthand an Islamic think tank. And there are many different ways to define think tanks. But the idea is to really focus on educating with some of these questions at the very beginning. So what is Sharia? What is Islamic law? Is there a difference between Sharia and Islamic law? And how does it actually relate to the way we here as Muslims live our lives today in America, in modern times? Like when we think of Sharia, is Sharia just set in the 7th century, and is our job as pious Muslims to go back and understand what did the text say? I mean, should we all throw away our toothbrushes and start brushing with miswax to be good Muslims? Our solution is no. I mean, we as an institute deal in crises. And I think that the 3 crises that I see them as is 1, a crisis of knowledge. The 2nd is a crisis of faith, and 3rd is a crisis of religion. And these are the 3 crises that we deal with. So what do I mean by that? Let's start with the crisis of knowledge. How many people have Facebook accounts? I'm sure everyone has Facebook accounts. And how many of you have actually liked a page that has anything to do with Islam, Islamic knowledge, Islamic anything? Okay, me too. And I have to tell you, I find it extremely depressing because you see people pontificate and give their opinion about anything under the sun. People get in fights, it degenerates into very upsetting things. And this is even among Facebook pages that are grouped by scholars and people who are studying Islamic studies and people who are academics. And the problem is that you end up getting in fights with people where you are effectively on the same playing field as someone who knows absolutely nothing about Islam, Islamic law, Sharia, anything. And it's extremely depressing. I'm sure if people have taken the time to engage in any kind of reaction to someone's post or trying to argue with someone, you know it absolutely goes nowhere. But everyone is on social media. That's where a lot of people get their information about what is authentically Islam or not. Now, if you go to the masjid and you listen to a khutbah, most of the people who deliver the khutbahs are doctors, engineers, computer scientists. Not many of them are Islamic scholars. They approach Islam, Sharia, Islamic jurisprudence as a hobby. So they have a full-time career doing something else. So this is like akin to saying if you want medical advice on heart disease, you're going to go to your computer scientist friend and ask him what you should do. Or if you need advice on how to write your taxes, that you go to your engineer friend. That's how we have come to think about issues that have to do with Islamic jurisprudence and Sharia and Islam. And it's very hard to navigate where do we get what is authentic and what is right. So that crisis of knowledge leads to crisis of faith, right? We see our kids are leaving the faith. They are not finding things that speak to their hearts and their minds. You ask a question about anything that has to do with Islam, and you get a stupid answer. And you're maybe embarrassed to say that it's stupid, but it does not ring true to your heart, and it definitely does not satisfy your intellect. So we see the youth are leaving, and we see, again, people are very confused about what is Islam supposed to be. And then what happens then is number 3, crisis of religion. Look at where Islam is in the world today. There's not a lot of good news, obviously. There's a lot of problems. We have a lot of, we really are not necessarily respected, whether it be in academic circles, in religious circles, and that there is a very, very active Islamophobia network. And are people aware of the Islamophobia network? Have you heard of this? Show of hands. Okay, well, there was a really good report done called Fear Inc. that was done in, I think, 2008, and it tracked the money. There's a very sophisticated network of people that have, that particular report showed that there was $57 million being funneled into this network, this creation of Islamophobia. So you've got basically so-called scholars that are creating the truth about what Islam is and how hateful of a religion it is. And that knowledge is getting funneled then to people who are activists or who basically spread it. And it's, and people who spend a lot of time and money on marketing and getting the message out. You've got self-hating Muslims, people who have left the faith because it's so hateful. And then you have a media arm. There's a whole network. Another report that was done more recently by CARE in 2016 showed that there are 33 organizations that their primary focus is on anti-Islam and Islamic hatred. So these are people, and that 33 group has access to $205.8 million. So they spend their days and their nights just doing anything and everything to promote the hatred for Islam. And this was prior to Trump getting elected. So you can now imagine how that's grown. And that study was just on the primary group. There's also an ancillary group that their focus is not purely on anti-Islam, but they take a lot of money and add to that effort too. So you can see that there's a lot, we're really in not a great situation. So what do Muslims do to counter this? Well, we have CARE, we have MPAC, we have a few other Muslim organizations, we have a lot of activist groups. But the thing that is really difficult is, again, we have not a lot of people who spend all of their time, 24/7, studying the Islamic tradition, Islamic jurisprudence, Sharia, people who can actually create the knowledge. We have problems finding money to support students in Islamic studies. Muslims don't support causes like ours, educational institutes, think tanks. They have a lot of individual efforts, but we don't make a lot of progress, quite frankly. So here we are the Usuli Institute. So in this context, sorry to deliver a lot of bad news, but it's this context in which we are trying to make a difference. And so we launched at the end of last year, and so far what we've done, we're a nonprofit organization. We're applying for 501c3 tax status. We've held monthly educational meetings and conversations with intellectuals. And we really hope that we can find people to support this cause, which is, come on in, which is bringing us back to an appreciation for knowledge and helping to address these crises. So the crisis of knowledge, what we do in terms of addressing the crisis of knowledge is we educate people about this crisis of knowledge, and that it's not okay that we get our best information about Islam from Facebook or from doctors and engineers and computer scientists, but people who actually have dedicated their entire lives and their entire savings and so forth into promoting scholarship. And that's what we do. That's what Dr. Abou El Fadl has done. That's what our life has been about. We've been married for 23 years, and in our entire existence, we've put everything we have into books and scholarship and knowledge and educating people. And we approach knowledge in a very different way than I think other organizations. We have actually, the Usuli Institute has a list of values, and one of them is that there is no embarrassment in religion, and that we're very honest and transparent. So we pride ourselves in being very honest and testifying as to our situation and trying to really change the way people think and talk about our faith. As opposed, in terms of the crisis of faith, it's not just about intellectual engagement. I mean, certainly, we believe very strongly that Sharia and Islamic jurisprudence has to be very reasonable. So when people can ask questions about what does Sharia say about this, what does Islamic law say about that, that the answer has to be reasonable. And Dr. Abou El Fadl has written books and books about this particular approach and this particular methodology. On top of that, it needs to be beautiful, morally beautiful, and spiritually beautiful. It has to be, worthy of the divine. And again, Dr. Abou El Fadl has written a lot of books about this as well. And hopefully, if we are able to produce thought that is compelling to the heart and speaks to your mind, we can strengthen that faith, address the crisis of faith, and start looking at how we can address issues that confront all of us in terms of our religion. Now, in terms of a little bit about us, so I'm a convert of 24 years. I actually converted to Islam before I met Dr. Abou El Fadl. And just a very brief story, I became interested in Islam when I was at business school. I was at Cornell University, and I was born and raised here in primarily California. My parents were Taiwanese immigrants, and so they came here and were very much about material success and trying to establish themselves and all the same issues that all immigrants have. And thankfully, I grew up in a very affluent area. I grew up in Palo Alto, and was raised in a very educated white neighborhood, and and was very much entrenched in American culture, very much like our kids now. They're growing up and they have expectations to get a good job, get a good education, and all of that. And there's no space for religion in that. But what that led me to feel by the time I got to business school is that I really wanted more. I wanted to know what my purpose was, what is the meaning of this life. And I became very interested when I met a couple of Muslim classmates of what organized religion held for me. So it took me about 2.5 years to actually decide to convert through reading, through prayer, through knowledge, advancing knowledge. And I think that part of the work we do is trying to appeal to someone who grew up like me in this, country with no ties to anything Islamic. I had no familiarity with Arab culture, Indo-Pakistani culture. I mean, Islam was very scary for me, but I was able to learn and find my way. Now, I have to say that when I think of Islam today, I mean, it's been 24 years, so, every single year that I've chosen to remain a Muslim, it has had to speak to my heart, and it has had to speak to my mind, because it is so hard to be a Muslim these days. And it is so hard for people to find the faith and even think about converting to Islam. So, when I think of Islam, though, I think of, and thanks to the blessing of being married to Dr. Abou El Fadl and having knowledge constantly surrounding me, I think of confidence, I think of peace. I love being a Muslim. I have never missed a prayer. And this is not a point of, arrogance or anything like that, but I find so much peace in it. And I believe that if someone like me who grew up in this country with no reason to convert and all the reasons not to stay Muslim, if we can help other people find that path, then that's something that we're trying to serve. And so that's, really our work is trying to appeal to the mind and the heart and address these crises of faith. So anyway, thank you very much for this long introduction, but just to give you a sense of what we're doing, and then I would like to introduce Dr. Abou El Fadl. For those who are not familiar, he is a professor of law at the UCLA School of Law, and he teaches Islamic jurisprudence, he teaches law and terrorism, he also teaches courses on human trafficking and human rights, and he has a new course on Muslims, race, and the law. So he's doing a lot of very important work, but he also has won the Oslo Human Rights Award, which for a Muslim is quite extraordinary, and he has, there's so much to say, but anyway, thank you.
Great. Would you mind, please, if I say something?
Absolutely. Oh.
Yes, I apologize. My wife and I, my name is Guido Santi, Tina Mascara. About a year ago, we got outrage about the Muslim ban, and we are documentary filmmakers. Our films are on Amazon, Netflix, and we decided to embark on a journey making a film about Islamophobia. We were so lucky that during our research we read some of the books by Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl, and we were completely taken by his perspective, his depth, and the beauty. Dr. Fadl speaks a lot about beauty. So we have been following for about a year. A year is going to be in a month. So we are making a documentary. The fact that we're filming doesn't mean that necessarily, or filming you doesn't necessarily mean that you will be in the documentary. If you don't want to be photographed, you just let us know eventually at the end. We will try not to be in your face, but we will have to do cover-up, so meaning showing the faces of people. And it's very important also for us to see the participation to this great event. So if any of you doesn't want to be photographed, at the end, just let us know. We will blur your face, so there is no problem, okay? So if you have any question, approach us at the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming and for I know that the most valuable investment human beings have is their time, and we exercise choices all the time about how we spend time, and so I'm very grateful that you're here. I am, I'll assume that no one here knows anything about my work or the Usuli Institute or any of that, but I've lived my entire life initially pursuing knowledge for the sake of knowledge. At a very early point in life, I took to heart what I believe is the quintessential message of Islam, and that is to dignify human beings and elevate them by taking them away from their enslavement to their base desires and their impulses, to beings that pursue meaning and pursue truth. And of course, at a very early age, I was astounded that there is no greater honor than the honor of pursuing knowledge. And that in Islam, the one status below the status of prophets is the status of scholars and those who pursue knowledge. And of course, I was raised on what, for a Muslim, raised in this tradition is all elementary material, that an hour spent in pursuing knowledge is worth more than 1,000 rak'ahs. And many, I mean, if you just want to do an exercise, you can just go to Bukhari and look up the chapter on ilm or the chapter on knowledge and just read some of what the Prophet ﷺ is reported to say about the pursuit of knowledge. And at a very early point as well, you discover that knowledge is very much like a reflection of the creator of knowledge, Allah, the creator. It's infinite and it's limitless, and it's an astounding ocean upon ocean, and that the more you pursue it, the more you become cognizant of your own ignorance and your own limitations, and that the joy of pursuit of knowledge is like no other for those who taste it. And so, you know, those who have seen the Usuli Institute, what used to be our house, our home in Van Nuys, we used to live in a house in Van Nuys, and then because I have a very patient and tolerant wife, she would not object to all the books that I would read. And as I would read book after book after book, eventually we ran out of space in the house. The books were in the den, in the living room, in the bedroom, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, and we had to move to a different house and leave the books in what became the house for books, and that's the Usuli Institute. Where, I mean, well over 1 million volumes at this point. And as a scholar, as an academic, in many ways, you can pursue this for its own sake and leave the world unfold the way it unfolds and not worry about it. In other words, I mean, the pursuit of knowledge is a ibadah, it's a form of worship, and you can worship and supplicate through the pursuit of knowledge in complete isolation and let the world do whatever it does and not care. When I first came to the United States, I think that in the early 80s, in 82, I think that the aspiration of being an academic and a scholar and nothing beyond that, in other words, I didn't really worry about whether I spoke in an Islamic center or whether I talk to Muslims or whether I talk to non-Muslims. The ibadah, the worship, the process of supplicating Allah and praising Allah through the pursuit of learning was enough. Things change, and change drastically when you become cognizant of an obligation to stand up for a faith that I believe fervently is not just a salvation for Muslims, not just a salvation for Americans and American Muslims, but it's a salvation for humanity. And let me tell you, when I say something like a salvation for humanity, that simple statement has behind it volumes and volumes and volumes of philosophy from every genre of philosophical thought that you can imagine. From Greek philosophy, from the philosophy of the Sophists, to Aristotelian philosophy, to Platonic philosophy, to the philosophy of Jewish intellectuals through centuries of history, to centuries of Christian theologians and philosophers, to the centuries of Muslim philosophers, to the Enlightenment and the rise of secular philosophers, to centuries of natural philosophers, to our moment. And all of this philosophical journey has only strengthened my conviction that Islam is a salvation for humanity. I fear, however, that unfortunately, it is not just people like me who live in the folds of book that realize the potential, the power that is inherent in the Islamic message. But to be quite honest with you, I also studied with the teacher of Daniel Pipes, the great Islamophobe, Bernard Lewis. I studied with Bernard Lewis at Princeton, and so I have a special insight in the making of Islamophobes. And I can tell you that during the course of the 80s and the 90s, it is not just people like me who realized the enormous normative, and normative is a fancy word for moral potential of the Islamic message, but the Islamophobes realized the same. The difference is that they realized the same, but they were willing to make an investment in the moral defeat of Islam, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I observed it because I observed how Bernard Lewis trained Daniel Pipes and how Bernard Lewis set up an organization with Daniel Pipes. At the time, what they worried about the most, and it started out initially, was a commitment and a belief in the destiny of Israel. The belief was that in the 80s and 90s there was a growth of Muslim and Arab organizations in the United States. There was people like Senator Paul Findley who wrote a famous book. If you haven't had an opportunity to read, you should read it, called They Dare to Speak Out. To make a long story short, and if you have questions about that, I'll be happy to elaborate, but there's a lot that one can say, so I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. There is a momentum in which Islam was spreading in the United States and in the West. And it was spreading with vigor. And not only that, but Arab organizations were also organizing to to balance out the lobbying power of pro-Israeli organizations in Washington, D.C. And people like Paul Findlay were starting to speak out and say, the Israeli lobby is a problem for the United States and the West. From this genesis, people like Bernard Lewis, who at the time was at Princeton, before that at Harvard, met people like Samuel Huntington, and they emerged with the idea, the belief, that Israel will never be safe in the middle of the Muslim world unless the threat of Islam is neutralized. Now, whether right or wrong, I'm saying that's the conviction. That's what they believed. That the Muslim world can never allow to develop an ideological momentum by which they regain a civilizational identity. In other words, Muslims cannot start thinking in terms of words like ummah and a sense of kinship and belonging. Taking their cue from what happened with the Iranian Revolution, because the Iranian Revolution started in the West, especially France and the United States. Samuel Huntington, and especially Bernard Lewis and his students, said more threatening than any Muslim movement in the Muslim world is Islam in the West. Because if Islam becomes normalized, Muslims will attain political power, and if they attain political power, they will leverage their political power, and if they leverage the political power, what happens in Egypt, what happens in Saudi, what happens in Bahrain, what happens in Kuwait, what happens in Jordan, what happens in Syria, we will not be able to control through the Israeli lobby anymore. So what was the solution to their mind? For them, the solution was there has to be a systematic demonization of Islam in the West. At the time, they really believed that Islam was the fastest growing religion in the world. Although sociologically it has not been proven. But they really believed that. And they looked at things like the African-American Muslim spread, the advancement of the African-American Muslim movement, and I'll tell you that Bernard Lewis wrote his book on slavery, and I was present when he was talking about that, to neutralize the spread of Islam among black Americans. Because he worried that black Americans were starting to believe that Islam was morally opposed to slavery, and he wanted to say effectively, no, Islam is not morally opposed to slavery. Muslims have been slave traders all their life. And to turn off black Muslims or black African Americans from the attraction of Islam. Now, this correlated at the same time with the rise of the right. And I'll tell you, the rise of the right, the Christian right, not just in America, but in the West generally, started out not as an activist movement. It started out as a philosophical orientation. And I'm going to tie this to what Grace was talking about in a second. During the Enlightenment, and I'm here going back with you to the 17th century, Europe, the Enlightenment started out a fundamentally and quintessentially a Christian movement. The idea that you can be a good, faithful, devout Christian, but also be committed to empirical knowledge, science, reason, and rationality. Many of the great scientists of the Enlightenment and many of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment were committed Christians. However, European philosophy and by extension American philosophy, but took a very sharp bent in the post-Enlightenment period, and that is the development of atheistic philosophical enlightenment. In other words, philosophers like Nietzsche, even philosophers like Kant, started by saying, we can be moral human beings, we can be rational human beings, we can be virtuous human beings without the belief in God. We can take God out of the equation and still be thoroughly moral. And in fact, they went a step beyond that and said, God, in fact, hampers morality. Now, for a long time, secularist philosophy seemed to be supreme without a response by religious philosophers. Until a turning point in the 40s and 50s where a number of Christian and Jewish, but mostly Christian, but there were some major Jewish philosophers like Martin Buber, like Levinas, who started systematically responding to secularism and saying that secularism is leading humanity to a life without a purpose, life without an objective. And that in the long term, what's going to happen to humanity is that humanity will be degraded and destroyed. Now, this group of philosophers inspired a robust activist political movement that we became aware of in the United States in the rise of the Christian right. But you have to realize that this didn't just pop up in the 90s out of nothing. It started decades earlier in a systematic intellectual movement. Now, the Christian right conceived of a concept that became very useful for the pro-Zionist movement. And that is the idea that modernity, civilization, everything in modernity, everything you see, from cars to planes to electricity to computers to everything, is a product of Judeo-Christian values. In other words, Judaism and Christianity, not secularism, not atheism, but Judaism and Christianity cumulatively produced the values that allowed for scientific advancement, for industrialization, for human rights, for humanitarianism. Now, and here's where we become relevant, that this Judeo-Christian civilization exists in opposition to civilizations that are not Judeo-Christian. Now, so what civilization is not Judeo-Christian? The only civilization they found that they can point to is Islam. This correlated to a time in the 80s and 90s where the number of Muslims in the West is rising sharply, and the proponents of the Judeo-Christian intellectual trajectory looked at this and said, this is extremely dangerous. This is very dangerous for the future of our societies in Europe and the United States. What do? Well, we mobilize and we create an alliance with our natural allies, the pro-Israeli lobby, the Daniel Pipes. This is how a Robert Spencer from the Christian right became wedded to Daniel Pipes from the Zionist right. They met together. They met especially with a well-known and well-documented group of industrialists and financiers, convinced them of the danger that they meet. They convinced them that Western civilization is in danger by the rise of Islam, and got them to fund everything from their intellectual, and the way they work is actually wonderfully synchronistic. There's about 20 intellectuals that are very well funded. Now, I'll tell you, all these intellectuals, for the most part, are failures in the academia. They couldn't get jobs in the academic market. But it didn't matter, because with money, you can create your own academic forum. Those 20 intellectuals, all of them have doctorates, all of them have some intellectual credentials. Daniel Pipes graduated from Harvard. Work closely with a group of activists, and these activists don't pretend to be intellectuals, in the same way that the intellectuals don't pretend to be activists. They coordinate their movements with well-known media outlets like Fox, like Sean Hannity and so on, and with certain politicians. So it's four groups: the intellectuals, the activists, the politicians, and the media. And we will try to put on the screen at the end a chart where you'll actually see the connections drawn. What is amazing is that money can engineer a great deal of falsehood. Now, where are Muslims in this? And this is what brought people like me out of our little intellectual scholarly cocoons to talk to people and to go to the Islamic Center and to start giving khutbahs and things like that. Unfortunately, Muslims continue to buy into the dicta of Islam is the fastest growing religion, and the belief that Allah will always protect Islam, which we can talk about is theology, because even if Allah protects Islam, Muslims can go through a great deal of hardship in the meanwhile, including our children. But most of all, Muslims continue to reproduce what, and again, it's a lot of concepts, and so if you're interested in knowing more, ask me at the end. But Muslims continue to reproduce something that was embedded in the cultures we came from by the colonial experience. Through colonialism, we Muslims, and all colonized, it's not just us Muslims, by the way, it's all colonized societies, whether Africa, South America, in all colonized societies, the populations that were colonized lost a sense of reverence for intellectual ideas and became completely wedded to empiricism. In other words, in all colonized societies, and there are wonderful studies about this, by the way, all colonized societies, we raise our children trusting in sciences, engineering, chemistry, physics, medicine, but distrusting ideas, philosophy, political science, sociology, anthropology. Why? Because in colonized societies, the imbalance in power dynamics makes ideas worthless. If you live in Egypt, what does it matter if you have a great political theory? The government, the military will come and say, "Allah اطلع برا, امشي." خلاص, خلصت, انتهينا. Right? It's done. You live in Pakistan, so what is? You have a great sociological theory. The government comes, wrap it up, done. Same thing with every colonized society. But we imported this with us to the West. When we immigrated to the West, we brought it with us. We didn't learn the value of what ideas do in modernized societies. So we continue to pay attention to the sciences, the empirical sciences. In the meanwhile, who became the scholars of Islam in our universities and our academies? It's Jews and Christians and atheists, and in other words, not Muslims. There used to be a joke at Princeton, when I attended Princeton. We used to joke that when it comes to jobs, might as well hang a sign saying Muslims need not apply. Because if you're a Muslim, the field is so controlled by non-Muslims that if you're a Muslim, it's very difficult to get a job. I'll tell you, we just hired someone at UCLA. Any person that applied to this job at UCLA had to pretty much, if they were a believing Muslim, had to pretend that they're not a believing Muslim. Because I'll tell you, although I am in the inside at UCLA, that if they were a believing Muslim, they would not be hired. Now, compare this to the field of Jewish studies, or to the field of Christian studies, or to the field of American studies, or Hispanic studies, or Mexican studies, or Japanese studies, or South Asian studies. Completely different. These people have owned their fields. Now, why does it make a difference in concrete terms? In concrete terms, what the truth about Islam, and I'll tell you what, in a nutshell, what I believe this truth is. The truth about Islam, it could be as wonderfully articulated as you want, but unless you can speak the language of the age and the language of the context, it's worthless. So I'll tell you, I'll put it in this way. You come to Muslims today and say, what is the basis of Islamic norms? Quran and Sunnah, right? You've lost the battle right there. Because Quran and Sunnah scares people. They hear the words Quran and Sunnah and they feel foreign and alien. Now, in the language of the age, now compare this to saying, what is the basis of Jewish normativity? And you say, well, it is the Torah and the oral tradition, which is the Talmud. It has a neutral effect. It doesn't scare you. It doesn't produce dread. One sociologist put it wonderfully. The effect of the Islamophobes, the effect of the clash of civilization plus the pro-Israeli group, is that they've created a sense of psychological dread. Think about this word, dread. About everything Islamic, not just in the mind of non-Muslims, but in the mind of our children as well. So the minute you hear words like jihad, sharia, Quran, sunnah, immediately you get a sense of cringe. That's dread. That cognitive association, and there are studies on how you create a cognitive association. That cognitive, that automatic cognitive association is manufactured purposefully and deliberately. It is not just haphazard. Those of you who are doctors should understand this, even if you're not psychiatrists, very easily. That you can condition the human mind to produce certain associations. Now, the problem is, the great problem is there are also studies that show that the attrition rate among our children is so high that if we live in a world, and this is, by the way, where Trump got the idea of banning immigration, is because he realized from various people like Michael Flynn and others, and what's his face, the crazy guy? Bannon.
Steve Bannon.
That the attrition rate among immigrant Muslims, the children of immigrant Muslims, is so high that the study said that if you stop immigration, Islam will vanish within 3 decades. Our children don't grow up proud being Muslims. They have a sense of dread about being Muslim. That if you cut off immigration, Islam will naturally disappear in 3 decades. When Bannon and Flynn and these people read that, they said, well, great, let's ban immigration. They weren't able to do it because of lawyers. But again, these lawyers, if we didn't have lawyers that cared enough about, and it wasn't Muslim lawyers that fought the ban and took people to court, it was unfortunately non-Muslim lawyers, because we don't have a cadre of lawyers. Now, let me tell you, since I brought you all of this, and I'm putting you in a sense of, even Islamophobia is a field of study. Even Islamophobia, there are scholars that do nothing but study Islamophobia. They're not going to come and speak to you here because they're in their classrooms. They're not going to go to the mosque and speak because they go to academic symposia and so on and so forth. But because we are so disorganized, because our activists try to pretend to be scholars and our scholars try to be activists, because we step on each other's toes all the time, the net effect is that we cancel each other out. SubhanAllah, that you would think that the first lesson Islam teaches all of us is that you cannot progress in life with some basic humility. And that humility makes you always doubt whether you are the best person to do X, Y, and Z. Well, among our current Muslims, you find this basic virtue absolutely lacking. I mean, you have people who have no business being politicians pontificate about politics, and people who have no business talking about scholarly issues pontificate about scholarship, and so on and so forth. Now, let me tell you why I think, and I'll make again, and I'll stop here and let you ask questions, because that always works better. The battle between human beings, as Allah reminds us in the Quran repeatedly, in numerous instances, we are wonderful creatures, and we are creatures that are nothing less than the bearers of the amana, the bearers of the trust, and the vicegerents, khulafa'illah, that we are the vicegerents of the divine. We've inherited this earth that Allah has given us. And it is a remarkable thing, because each one of us, we walk around embodying the divine, or at least the potentiality of the divine. As a Kindi, a great Muslim philosopher, said, that the divine is in the fold of our hearts, and we spend our life either peeling the layers that cover the divine up, or we submerge it further and bury it to the point that we can no longer recognize the divine within us. But, so in the same way that we have that, and the divine is a potentiality of, as our great sages would say, the potentiality of husn. Inna Allah jamilun yuhibbu al-jamal. That the potentiality of manifesting beauty. the potentiality of manifesting the breath of the divine, which is quintessentially in equilibrium with the very nature of creation. In the same way that the cosmos has, the music of the cosmos follows a mathematical balance. The rules of creation follows a mathematical balance. Beauty within us itself is a potentiality that is limitless, practically limitless. Now, we, the modern, and it's an irony that modern human beings, we've lost our way so much that you'll find Muslims saying we're doing meditation according to Buddhist principles or according to Zen principles, completely unaware that within Islam, you don't need Zen principles and you don't need Buddhist principles. It's only because we've lost the connection between how prayer is and how dhikr is a more powerful meditative tool than anything that Buddhism or Zen philosophy or Tao philosophy has ever produced. That Insan al-Sawi, and Muslim al-Mustaqim, is a thoroughly balanced human being that has an equilibrium between realizing their self-worth and at the same time averring and rejecting arrogance and extension of the self beyond its proper limits. In other words, Insan al-Sawi, Insan fi wazn al-Mustaqim, that they're anchored in an equilibrium of a balance, of a mizan. Now, this is combined with our potentiality as human beings, the shaitan in us, a shaitanat al-insan, that the human being is also attracted to an arrogance that makes them reject their connections to the divine and reject their fundamental gratitude to the divine. In other words, we are born initially realizing, fully aware that we must realize our potentials and the extent of our dependence. And love is a form of gratitude, by the way. If love is not gratitude, then it is not real love. But as we grow, you know, it's that human beings gravitate towards a lack of gratitude and a sense of entitlement. This, in short, is the struggle between Tawheed and paganism. The struggle between the God of Ibrahim from the beginning of time and those who oppose the Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ. In other words, Islam is the natural articulation, the only expression of true Tawheed, because every attempt at Tawheed before Islam was derailed. If you think of Judaism, their Tawheed became a form of tribalism. In Christianity, their Tawheed became mixed with a very primitive form of paganist belief in the classic notion of Trinity. And the idea of Trinity is very old in paganist ideas, paganist thought. Islam is the only affirmation of Tawheed of Ibrahim, the Prophet Ibrahim, onto the rest of the lines of the Prophet. Now, what does Tawheed do to a human being? Tawheed is the realization that in your process of submission to Allah is your freedom from being enslaved by anything else, whether another human being or even desires like materialism and consumerism. In other words, Tawheed, as it did in the rise of the Islamic liberation, Islamic civilization, which, by the way, when our kids learn our history and they sit there and say, oh, it wasn't jihad, it's all, I put it in a different way. I tell my students, there was not just an Islamic civilization, there was an Islamic liberation in human history. The life of the Prophet was the life of a freedom fighter establishing a theology of human liberation that flowered in the Islamic civilization that produced the philosophical and scientific and intellectual and humanistic insights that, but for the existence of these humanistic insights, the Enlightenment in Europe would have never been. And people like Maimonides in Judaism would have never been. For all the philosophical edifice that are built around figures in Judaism like Maimonides, Maimonides was thoroughly the product of his Muslim context. If you know who Maimonides is, Musa bin Maimun and so on, which is very central to the people who say there's a Judeo-Christian civilization against a Muslim civilization. It's so historically idiotic that it doesn't take a very deep scholar to deconstruct it, if that scholar knows what they're talking about. To deconstruct the idea of a Judeo-Christian civilization in opposition to Islamic civilization, it's child play. It's like playing with, it's like, you know, telling children, get out of here. Because it's so intellectually superficial. Anyway, let's go back to Tawheed. Now, what Christian and Jewish philosophers that responded to secularism, what fundamentally they were responding to is the fact that secularism, but secularism in the sense of atheism, wanted to anchor people in moral values without a divine being and ended up making human beings uprooted and without a purpose. Put differently, if a human being accepts the idea that they are created without allegiance to a supreme being that tells them what the right path is, human beings become self-referential. What does that mean? A human being worships himself or herself. Now, something happens about a human being when they worship themselves or herself, and this is in history. They become completely enamored with consumption. And this is throughout human history, by the way, not just in our modern age. They become as if grazing animals, but at a very different scale. We don't consume grass, but we consume fancy things, furniture, jewelry, cars. And what these Christian and Jewish theologians that responded to secularism and which produced eventually the movement of the right wing in the West and the entire Islamophobia industry is that they basically said, we need Judaism and Christianity to bring back humanity to a moral objective that is beyond just a materialistic paradigm. But they also at the same time realized that if you want an effective theological and philosophical response to all the dangers that materialism posed for modern human beings, you will not find a more powerful articulation and a more persuasive articulation than in Islam. And it is this realization that fired them up to demean everything associated with Islam to the point that where we ended up today. This is an intellectual awareness that you carry around that is quite a heavyweight. But it is at the same time liberating, because it is a matter of if Muslims wake up and become aware of their historical moment, I believe it would be possible to turn the entire paradigm completely around. And let me stop here and take questions.
Does anyone have any questions they'd like to? Please.
Thank you, Dr. Abou El Fadl.
And by the way, you could ask me about anything. You know, even if you want to ask about the miswak, fine. So it doesn't have to be about Islamophobia and civilizations and all of that.
Well, one of the things that we do when we have our monthly meetings is we really emphasize to people not that, one, there's no embarrassment in religion. That's one of our points of value. And we ask people, we say, any question is welcome, and there's nothing off limits.
Can I just say something, because I know I have a hard time when I start. I'm usually not a very talkative person, and I'm definitely not a social person, and I apologize to all of you, because if I was a social person, I would have been able to make connections that activists make. I'm not an activist. I never was, never will be, and as Grace will tell you, by nature, I gravitate towards being alone and in isolation. The problem is that once I open this mouth, I have a hard time shutting it. And so I can't resist just saying one other thing. I want to say, and those who are my students would have heard me say this a million times, what made Muslim theologians and philosophers what they were in the Islamic civilization is not because they studied the Quran and Sunnah. And let's be very honest about this. It's because they reconciled and let's put it this way, studied the Quran and Sunnah in relation to the epistemology of their day and age. What does that mean? What does that mean? To the systems of knowledge of their day and age. So what made Hamid al-Ghazali? What made even al-Shafi'i? What made al-Kindi? What made Ibn Tufayl? What made Ibn Sina or Ibn Rushd or all of these people? Is that in their time and age, if you wanted to engage the systems of knowledge of your time, you didn't just study the Quran and Sunnah, you studied the Quran and Sunnah, but you also studied Aristotelian philosophy. So for instance, in the Islamic tradition, when you find a reference to Al-Muallim al-Kabir, the great teacher, a lot of Muslims, when they find that reference, they think they're talking about the Prophet. They're not talking about the Prophet. They're talking about Aristotle.
About what?
Aristotle.
Oh.
Aristotle.
Yeah.
Aristotle.
And Muallim al-Kabir is not the Prophet. Muallim al-Kabir, the great teacher, is Aristotle. We teach this to our students because I can't tell you, there's a lot of things to learn. So you studied Aristotelian logic, you studied sophistical, what they call propositional logic or abstract logic. You studied a certain form of hermeneutics. Now, our day and age has its own epistemology and systems of knowledge. You cannot study the ancient systems of knowledge and think, oh, now I'm brilliant, I can do the Quran and Sunnah. Or and just say, I'm just going to study the Quran and Sunnah and I don't have to worry about systems of knowledge of my day and age. That is what made Muslims so backwards and retarded. You cannot be a faqih today. All these people from Azhar and whatever, Quran and Allah, in my eyes, they're not fuqah. A faqih must study the Quran, the Sunnah, the fiqh, and modern systems of knowledge. Modern philosophy, modern sociology, modern anthropology, modern hermeneutics. Without it, you're not a faqih. You're not knowledgeable. You cannot address something like Sharia otherwise. So let's be very clear. Someone that knows the Quran and Sunnah, because I don't believe you can know the Quran and Sunnah, the true purpose, the maqasid al-Sharia, without understanding the epistemology, systems of knowledge of your day and age. So someone that comes and says, I studied the Quran and Sunnah in Mecca or Medina or in Azhar, but I have no idea of who vapor is in sociology. Or I have never read the philosophy of Kant. I'd say you're worthless. You have no value. Someone that comes and says, I've read Kant and I've read vapor and I've read it, but I don't know anything about the Islamic tradition. In my view, for me, they're worthless. It must be both. Yes, it's hard, but we will not come out of our kabwa, our disastrous condition, unless we do that. And that's exactly what the Christian and Jewish theologians who responded to secularism, or atheism to be more precise. Did. It just wasn't one or the other. Okay, I'll shut up now.
I just want to say, I'm sorry, we'll get back to your question. But, you know, I think what we're doing here is really special. You may or may not have understood a lot of what was said here, because it's complicated and it requires special knowledge and special, it's like this is what dedicating your life to knowledge produces. Is oftentimes
every
you're
time
speaking.
we're driving, Bad Grace chides me for, why do you say things that people don't understand? Can't you slow down? Just say, take a little bit of what you said and focus on that. You don't have to cover so much, so my apologies, I'm sorry.
No, and I don't want, I wanted people to understand that this is what is missing, right? You don't hear this when you go to the mosque. And the fact that you have people like Dr. Abou El Fadl, who can dedicate his entire life to reaching this point. This is what is going to help Muslims get out of where they are. I mean, when I, and I'm sorry to bring this to myself, but when I converted, I had to find something that made sense to me. I'm a logical person. And when I became a Muslim, I went to the mosque for the first time. I didn't go to the mosque before I converted. At the mosque, I began hearing and seeing things that just did not make sense. They did not comport with what I was reading in the books of Islam. And I was exposed to Wahhabi Islam. So when I asked questions, which to me were very basic, like even something as simple as hijab, okay? So what if you wear hijab? A hijab is intended to be a protection for women. So what happens when hijab becomes, makes women a target? Should they still wear hijab? I think that's a fair question. And it's a very relevant question, especially today. But I could not ask that at the mosque. People did not want me asking questions. And thank God that I was able to marry someone that every time I had a question, every time I saw something that I didn't understand or that was stupid, I had a place to go and ask, okay, explain this to me, I don't get it. And that was the blessing that most Muslims
when we met, one of the questions that I know of course where it comes from, because I grew up in this environment and so on, but she was told that as a Muslim woman cannot laugh. That it is, it's haram to show your teeth when you laugh. So can you imagine when this is what we do with our converts? I mean, of course, at the time, I had to sit there and be quiet, restrain myself and not lose it and explain where that comes from, what is because there is a hadith that actually says that, by the way, that you shouldn't show your teeth when you laugh. But the fact that there's a hadith doesn't mean anything. So what? I mean, that is the fallacy of textualism, is that just because there's a hadith, it means there's also a rule. That's not the way Sharia works at all. The hadith is the beginning of the journey, not the end. But you can imagine, I mean, we've had a long journey together.
I mean, the point that I'm trying to make is that if we want Islam to appeal to our children and our grandchildren, it has to make sense. They have to be able to ask any question without fear, and they have to get an answer that makes that speaks truth to their heart and is pertinent to their reality. And until we do that, our kids are going to run away. And that's what we're trying to do, is create an environment where people can ask any kinds of questions, and recognize that when a scholar who has that level of knowledge can actually explain to you, why this or doesn't make sense, then you can, and in the 23 years that we've been married, it's like I have learned seeing, questions answered and how, people are dealt with, that not only does Islam have an answer, but Islam has something even, it's a methodology, it's a way of thinking. So what we're trying to teach people is, number one, not everyone can be a scholar. I'm not a scholar. I didn't understand everything you just said. But what I understand is that The methodology is about seeking beauty, moral beauty, ethical beauty. You know, if you're not a scholar, you know in your heart what is beautiful without anyone telling you, and you know what is ugly without anyone telling you. So you have your own, you know, internal radar for what is authentic to Islam and authentic to the divine and not. And that you should trust that, and that you should, you know, you don't have to be a scholar. Not everyone is intended to be a scholar. But we need our scholars, you know, and we need to be able to compete at that level, because if our best scholars are the people that are telling you, and I heard this at the mosque, you're not allowed to wear pigskin shoes because Muslims don't eat pork, so of course you can't wear them on your feet either. I mean, seriously, this was the level of scholarship when I was a convert. Or that I should not speak to men. Or that, you know, I had a very normal, you know, like I was working in a corporate environment and I had just a normal shirt, and haram, you know, you show this much of your neck, and haram. You know, this is the kind of stuff that makes people run away. So you have to have something that's reasonable, beautiful, truthful, you know, honest, unafraid, unafraid. We don't have the answers. We will talk about it. And we have to get our best minds. You know, not everyone is qualified to do this work. But people who are qualified can't even find a job. We don't even have money from the Muslim community to support the scholars. You know, someone like Dr. Abou El Fadl, if he were in the Jewish tradition or in the Christian tradition, we would have support, financial support like nothing. You know, like you could not believe. But because we don't accept money from the Saudis, we don't accept money from anyone who has, you know, any kind of political orientation or any kind of agenda, we're on our own. So we have no savings except all of our 1 million books. You know, everything we have gets poured into knowledge. And alhamdulillah, it's fine, this is our cause. But we Muslims, I mean, we have to work together. We have to see the danger in what our situation has become. And we have to, you know, part of our work is creating knowledge, but also supporting others who can be smart. And you know, it can't just be a handful of people.
Let people ask questions.
Sorry.
Dr. Abou El Fadl, I personally agree with you, and I think probably the majority of the people here agree with you that we are, you know, in a time where activists act as scholars and scholars act like activists. Probably activists act more, the scholars more than scholars act as an activist. But I don't know really how do we exit from this dilemma? What do we do? The way I see it, there are two problems. The first problem is the scarcity of enlightened and knowledgeable people. Not everybody is as lucky as Grace to have, you know, right next to her, a great source of knowledge and a great source of truth. So the scarcity of the people whom can we reach out to for opinions and ideas and education are not very many. And I'm not saying that there are not very many here in the West, and there are not very many in the Muslim world either. The second problem is that we were taught at a young age that there are no hierarchy in Islam, and we understood this, that there is no intermediary between you and God, and you don't have to go to a priest to make a confession or anything like that. But I feel that we have gone this, you know, a step further where everybody can ifti anything, basically becomes a scholar in his own right. Of course, that also is good in a way, otherwise we may end up with somebody like Bin Baz in Saudi Arabia become the ultimate source of truth, which would be a disaster. So I'm just trying to see how do we exit from this situation.
Let me answer the second part first, because you raise a really important point about there is no hierarchy in Islam, and absolutely Islam completely rejected the idea of priesthood, and there's a huge difference between a scholar and a priest, or even someone with a claim to a sacred status, whether of officially priest or not, is that the person who claims its scholarship should never become a venue for claiming sacredness or semi-sacredness. So in other words, just because you are a student of knowledge in no way attests to your moral virtue, in the same way that just because someone is an activist in no way takes away from their moral virtue. In terms of taqwa, we're all even intuitively raised that in terms of taqwa and the beauty of taqwa, a person who is cleaning the room could be of much higher status than someone that spends all his waking hours with books. So we're not talking about moral virtue, and it is very important that for Muslims to completely reject the idea of like the Bin Baz type of paradigm that somehow your scholarship makes you able to claim a privity with God, that somehow you have a special relationship with God. What scholarship does is it's like you deal with a teacher, or in the same way that you deal with ideas. You listen to the ideas, you listen to the material being offered, but ultimately no one can take away from your autonomy to either accept what you are hearing or reject it, or to even suspend belief about it. So in other words, we're talking about educators and not moral leaders. Moral leadership should be is a completely different paradigm. Now, but the way it is true that we have a crisis of unenlightened thinking. No one can deny that. But it is also true that since the beginning of the 20th century, what happened in the countries we come from is that governments came in and embraced Muslim reformers. They embraced the Muhammad Abdu of the world, they embraced the Rashid Ridas of the world. In other words, governments basically said to the population, the support of enlightened religious idea is the business of Wazarat al-Awqaf, the Ministry of Awqaf, or the Ministry of Religious Affairs. You, civil society, stay out of it. We, the government, and them, will give them salaries, we'll give them jobs. As a result, we grew up in societies where civil society is very weak. Civil society, people don't take responsibility for, and this is why, you know, it's very, when the Arab Spring happened and so on, everyone was talking about بناء المجتمع المدني, building civil society, because people looked around and realized we don't have a tradition of civil society. And what civil society basically means is that you have non-governmental organizations that lead society, that organize society, that you don't rely on the government to do everything. Now, we as immigrants, we come from cultures where civil societies are non-existent, because we rely on our governments to run our mosques, to tell us what's right and what's wrong, to run our TVs and so on. But we've came to societies now, to states in which this is extremely dangerous. Unless we as private individuals realize that we must develop an ethic of a strong civil society, we're going to be obliterated. Because in the West, every group, whether that group is ethnic or religious or racial, cannot rely on government or state money for its self-determination, it must rely on its own resources. Taxes are not spent to promote ethnic groups or religious groups or racial groups, and even we have constitutional restrictions on that in America, and a lot of European countries as well. There are numerous restrictions on that. So civil societies are very important. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because just in my time in the United States, I can't tell you the number of people that I've seen appear on the scene that could have made an enormous difference if they were properly supported, but that fizzled out into marginality because not properly supported. And I won't, for example, I remember back in the 80s, I met a young graduate student, and I'll mention that name just because it's a real experience. A fellow, he was a convert, Vincent Cornell. He was a graduate student at UCLA. Vincent Cornell is just one among so many, but it was definitely an extremely promising intellectual moment. Eventually, he had to be absorbed by the secular academia because there was no Muslim support. There's no Muslim interest in anything that scholarship can produce, because Muslims don't believe that activists need to be educated and need to coordinate their activity with, in the same way, and that's why I started with the example of Islamophobia. That activists guided their behavior, pair what they learned from a Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis in many ways created the ideology of Bernard Lewis and company, because there are many others. But Muslims don't have that type of orientation at all. They expect from activists to engage also in historical analysis, in sociological analysis, and anthropology. And activists themselves think themselves that they are qualified to do it. So they have no coordinated effort. And as a result, I mean, I can name so many. There was another fellow, Khaled Blankenship, who was also extremely promising. At Berkeley at one point, was a very promising scholar, Hamid Algar. Before that, of course, was Fazl Rahman, who was ejected from Pakistan, and so on. Point is, and right now, I can easily name 20 Muslim scholars who are beginning their careers now, that if there were proper support by the Muslim community, they could produce an enormous intellectual impact. But 20 years from now, I assure you, because of the lack of support, they will be completely absorbed by the secular academia. And meaning that as an academic, you start out your career with a lot of bright ideas, and a lot of ideas that you're interested in exploring that are oriented towards helping your fellow Muslims. But as you learn that Muslim organizations and your fellow Muslims have no appreciation and no interest in what you produce as a scholar, who becomes your audience increasingly as time passes by? Non-Muslims, right? You write for fellow academics. And eventually, because Muslims become increasingly irrelevant in your life, irrelevant for your tenure, irrelevant for your promotion, irrelevant for any career advancement you achieve, increasingly your scholarship becomes increasingly irrelevant for Muslims. So, and that is the orientation that I've witnessed time and time again. Young scholars start out with very bright aspirations. 20 or 30 years later, they live in a little cocoon, writing books that are increasingly of intellectual interest to them, but no longer engages in anything that the rest of the Muslim community engages in. And they basically tell you, yeah, I tried and I gave up. And I mean, you'd be surprised in how many? I mean, and in every school that you imagine. I knew people in Rutgers, I knew people in the University of Pennsylvania, I knew people in Princeton, someone at Yale. The guy at Stanford left, he's now at Notre Dame. At UCLA, there are, I tell you stories about UCLA and just UCLA. So you get the point.
Yeah.
You get the point. But we and it takes it's difficult because as immigrants, it's very difficult for us to think we must create our own institutions, and we have no right to whine and complain unless we create our own civic institutions. And it is not enough, and this is a point that I must add, it is completely ineffective for us to engage in pretend institutions. And I've actually written this and published it, which for an academic to do, by the way, is sort of, I mean, if I cared about what my bosses say, I wouldn't publish it, but I did. Muslims in the West have gotten very good at creating what emotionally they can be comfortable with. So they create institutions that are not academic, meaning in the sense that they compete with the mainstream academia or with mainstream scholarship. They don't publish in Princeton Press, Harvard Press, University of California Press. They publish in little Muslim presses, and these pretend institutions exist in the Muslim ghetto, and they ghettoize Muslim thought. And to be very blunt, and because I'm a blunt person and I have no political affiliations and I don't care, I'm just going to say it. Institutions like Zaytuna, like Bayan, these are pretend academic institutions. They're not real academic institutions. They're not going to cut it intellectually. I'm sorry. Degrees from these institutions are worthless. When I get an applicant, someone applying for a PhD program from Bayan or from Zaytuna, we throw it away. We never admit any of their students. Because they don't compete with the intellectual mainstream. I'm very blunt, I'm sorry, and that's, by the way, that's why I have no supporters. Because I offend everyone equally. I have no friends.
No, yeah, I support you, that.
Please.
I am fascinated with the Reformation because I'm a scientist and I see the Reformation mean that intelligence, rationality, and you just mentioned it, and common sense and science is really making sense of religion. And so the Reformation was in the 15th and 16th century. We found it so amazing, and it changed Europe. The Renaissance started by Reformation.
Yeah,
and the Western civilization started by Isaac Newton. Okay, against the superstition of the church. They challenged the authoritarian nature of the church. And in the 17th and 18th century Arabia, we found that that's what they want to try to create, is an authoritarian religion that Europe rejected. So how we get out of that?
Before Europe rejected it, we rejected, Islam rejected it.
Yes, we did, but
in the very prophecy of Muhammad ﷺ, because it is quite remarkable. I mean, what do you do when, I just heard a so-called Muslim scholar in America here give a lecture about an Isra al-Mi'raj. And he was saying, the purpose of an Isra al-Mi'raj is to defeat rationalism forever. And this is someone who's a superstar, by the way. Someone who Muslims in America worship. When you get, what is Islam without rationalism?
Oh my God.
Islam came to take human beings out of the darkness of superstitious belief, out of the mythology of a God that doesn't respond to reason. a God that doesn't communicate with human beings through the medium of reason, to say that no, God, the intellect is from God, and in fact the greatest creation of God, of all creations, is the intellect. And that this intellect is such an amazing creation that it is the medium by which God communicates with us. It is our connection to the divine. When we lose our intellect, we lose our connection to the divine. And that is why the Prophet ﷺ says that liability is no longer upon the person who loses his mind, the majnoon. رفع قلم عن المجنون, because you no longer have the ability to resonate with divinity, resonate with the divine being. Now, of course, in so many ways, and it's quite remarkable. I mean, and this is there is a very wonderful book by. There are two books. One by a fellow called Nekostin about the rise of the Renaissance in Europe, and another book called The Rise of Colleges in Islam by a Christian Arab called George Maqdisi. What is wonderful about these two books is that they trace the influence of Islamic theology upon the philosophers that created the European Renaissance. Most notably, in figures like Thomas Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas was one of the very few honest European philosophers who actually, in his footnotes, accredited his Muslim sources to his credit. So he accredited Ibn Tufayl and Ibn Rushd and Ibn Haytham and so on and so forth. We've come a complete turnaround where the wedding between spirituality and rationalism, that mizan, that wonderful balance between the two, the essence of what defined the Islamic civilization, we've come back now and went all around to losing the value of what rationalism can mean, not just in the empirical sciences like chemistry and physics and so on, but even in the social sciences. That when you build the society, you must build the society upon rational principles. Because out of rational principles comes human rights, comes human values, comes the values of virtue. All are based on rational principles. Now, the fact that we Muslims today have completely lost the sense of what this means. If you ask any Muslim today, can you trace how do rational principles act as the foundation for moral virtue? The vast majority of Muslim intellectuals will look at you and say, huh? How is this related to the Quran and Sunnah, brother? That's a disaster. Now, what do? We must invest in the most valuable our resources. What does I mean, you guys who are doctors, I know nothing about your field, of course, but I go to doctors because I'm often sick, right? And what I am always told is to forgive myself for my ailments and to invest more and more energy and resources, so exercise, positive energy, whatever, in the parts of my body that still work, right? Now, the same rational principles apply when we want to get out of our disaster. So, again, I can easily, I'll even increase the number from 20 to 50. I can easily give anyone the names of 50 very good, solid scholars of Islam between Europe and the United States who only lack support. If given the support, they can produce an intellectual revolution, including start swinging the momentum of thoughts about what society says about Islam. Sadly, and this is a different issue, but sadly, one of the most prominent, well, maybe I shouldn't get to Ramadan. I'm going to leave that aside. I mean, I personally think what has been arranged against him is a conspiracy, but because I've looked at the evidence in the case, and yeah, but I mean.
Can I just say, okay, so I think, you know, along the lines of there's no embarrassment of religion, I think Tariq Ramadan is a perfect example. I mean, this is one of these taboo topics that nobody wants to talk about, everyone has an opinion about, and even the premise of presumption of innocence is wrongly understood by Muslims. And
yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, I agree. Because, and I tell you, I mean, as a Muslim, I felt the obligation to study the evidence in the case. And the evidence in the case is not there. And I have no relationship with Tariq Ramadan that makes me committed to defending him or anything like that. You know, in fact, I love attacking people, so you know, I would be happy to attack him if I believed that the evidence was there. But it's not. But it's extremely sad what happened to him.
go ahead, yes.
Thank you. I just want to ask you, one, if you've read any of Muhammad Shahrour books, or you're familiar with him.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask a couple of questions quickly so we can respond to those. So one, Muhammad Shahrour. The other is, have you done any cooperation in your institute with places, say, like Claremont Graduate University, that I assume is a better academic standard than the other ones that you were talking about, or with the new Vertical Center for Religious Freedom, actually right there at UCLA, if there's been any cooperation there? And three, just on your comment to Zaytuna and Bayan, don't you think that's a very good first step? I mean, we're not going to be Harvards at day one, but we certainly is a good step towards establishing something that can eventually be the opportunity of growing to becoming something meaningful.
Muhammad Shahrour, yes, I've read his work. I have to tell you, I mean, I've had many discussions with one time with Muhammad Shahrour at the University of Alexandria, and then with a number of his students. They're fruitful discussions. I mean, our debate is about epistemology and how does the discipline in modern epistemology can it be, how does it apply to the Quran? Ultimately, I don't agree with him on a lot of things, and I think that impoverishing the Islamic tradition by limiting our intellectual heritage to the Quran is problematic. It's problematic because that's not the way social science works. I think I'm also, I mean, Shahrour plays a political role that was, especially in a country like Egypt. But I mean, politics aside, on the intellectual merits, I mean, his first book was his most impressive. Then I'm not sure that the other books were not as careful, not as well thought out, not anyway. But yeah, I've had a conference with him at the University of Alexandria. It was a very interesting discussion, and then there were several after that several engagements with some of his students in Egypt. There was one event with Allah yarhamu Taha Jabir Alwan when he was in Egypt, and with some of the students, Muhammad Shahrour. Very fascinating conversation.
Are these on YouTube?
I'm not sure, but I'm sure we have a record of them. But were you in Egypt with me when? No? So if she doesn't tape me, I don't get taped. Yeah, but her and Sharif are the ones that always follow me around with recorders, but yeah, I'm not sure. Anyway, okay, so now the second issue about first step. You know, can you start a medical school without the founding of those who construct the medical school itself being people trained in medicine? I don't think so. The problem with Bayan and with Zaytuna is that there are, like engineering, there are rules for building anything. And there are rules for building academic institutions. So for instance, there was a founding of a law school in Irvine very recently. You know, it was a wonderful example of how you can create an academic institution. And the way, I mean, I'll tell you some of the basic rules, is that you bring always very experienced academics with credibility in the field, that start creating the foundations for intellectual credibility and the rules for intellectual engagement. The problem I have with Zaytuna and Bayan and similar organizations, because I'm not just picking on them, I mean, there are so many other Muslim organizations. There's, what's the name of that one in Texas? The son of Yaqeen Institute, and there are a whole number of them, is that they're always created by people who are not professionals in the field. But they're not created by academics. It would be completely different if you bought someone like Sherman Jackson, for instance, just so we can pick it. And you told Sherman Jackson, okay, I'm giving you money, start an academic institution. I can tell you with Claremont, initially Claremont, this is in the old days, very old days, started its conversation with me. And when they started their conversation, I told them, you are and I was very honest with them, and I'm very frank with them. I told them, you have a Christian orientation. My experience with Christian universities is that when they create an Islamic institution, they create a straw man. What I mean by that is that they create an intellectually inferior entity, so that in the world of academia, when you compare what comes out of the Christian institution to what comes out of the Muslim institution, the Christian institution is clearly superior. So, and I was very honest with them, and I told them that. And I told them that if you want to build something that shows good faith towards Muslims, then here are the people that you must engage. What they did instead is that they denied this poor Hamid Mavani tenure, and they completely disregarded every single academic name I gave them, and they went and built the institution with activists. And there is clear, I mean, it is places like Zaytuna, they reproduce the tradition without any recourse to modern epistemology. And they don't have anyone understand, not even the desire to have someone on their staff that is accomplished in the field of anthropology, in the field of sociology, in philosophy, in social theory. In other words, they're completely into the mindset of reproducing knowledge in taqlid form. So they take texts from the pre-modern world, translate them, and read them as if you can transpose texts of the 9th century and 10th century to our modern moment without anything further. Can that be a first step? Only if there is an awareness that there is a problem. But not if there is no awareness that there is a problem. Now, as to the Usuli Institute, I mean, because of my academic ties and academic connections, I wouldn't have a problem creating academic ties with the Western academia and the non-Muslim academia. I mean, that would be what I find to be challenging is engaging Muslims, reaching Muslims, not the, whether the Berkeley, there's also the Berkeley Center at the International Institute at UCLA, which I have very good ties with. The Promise Institute, which is a human rights institute at the law school at UCLA. I mean, all of these places I have very good relationships with. The Islamic law program at Harvard. Again, there are ties with Princeton University and their Near Eastern program, but that's not what we're talking about. This will amplify the voice of Khaled Abou El Fadl as an academic, and alhamdulillah, I'm already very well known as an academic, but not as interlocutor with the Muslim community, which is a completely different ballgame.
So, Dr. Abou El Fadl, I need to understand your view on, historical heritage of Islam in terms of books of tafsir and books on hadith. There are thousands and thousands of books that have been written on that, and I'm sure many of the students that go to universities, Islamic universities, that's what they focus on and study and understand. So what do you think? And how would a man on the street, understand Islam and without going into the philosophical aspects that you have been talking about?
There is a huge difference between a man on the street. Okay, let's put it this way. All human beings, every human being, we have a musallamat. A musallamat are the givens. Now, what are the givens? Every given, every intellectual given, every cognitive association in our brain is a product of a long history. We even call it a generational transfusion of systems of knowledge. So in the same way that you come to an American, an average person, and you say, it says to you, oh, it's my right to do this and do that. What they're reflecting in this moment is centuries of philosophy, but you don't need to be aware of these centuries of philosophy. All that intellectual heritage produced that moment that you have with the common person in the street that tells you, it is my right to do X, Y, and Z. So the role of the scholar and the role of the activist is to negotiate, and I use this term purposely, to negotiate these givens, these cognitive associations, so that the common person in the street has positive givens, positive cognitive associations, instead of harmful ones. So to produce an attitude among the average common person in which the common Muslim feels a sense of pride about their faith instead of a sense of shame, it takes a tremendous amount of historical and sociological work, but the average common person needs to know none of it, because they get their givens from school, from their social institutions, from their parents, from their friends. And in fact, it is harmful to try and wasteful, because as the Prophet said, that each person has a capacity and a purpose for their creation. And you can't go for a person whose capacity is to park cars or whatever and tell them, I want to talk to you about philosophy. Now, however, the obligation upon the activists in other words, the social engineers and the scholars who are thought engineers is extremely high. They have a very serious obligation. And yes, when it comes to them, they need to have a great deal of learning. Of course, now, when you say books of tafsir or so on, personally, one of the most dangerous things is, and one of the things when you have average Muslims open up books of tradition and try to plow through them, because it can only lead them astray. You cannot read books that were written in the 6th century Hijrah, 12th century AD, without being historically informed, historically embedded in the context of this book. When Tabari wrote his tafsir, Tabari was not writing in a vacuum. Tabari was completely a product of historical moment. Tabari was he was engaged in an intellectual project that was part of the entire unfolding of Islamic history till the moment that Tabari existed. And one of the worst things that happened in our modern age is that, because we felt threatened by colonialism and because we felt threatened by Westernism, we started saying, let's honor our tradition by printing it and just selling it in the market and making it available to lay people. And then each lay person starts opening a Razi, a Tabari, a Qurtubi, reading it and becoming thoroughly confused and confusing. You cannot imagine the amount of training we put students to in order to qualify them to be able to read a Razi or a Qurtubi and a Tabari. And I'll tell you, not the training just that you get at Azhar, because yes, you need the training in language, yes, you need the training in grammar, but the training in history and historical methodology, and the training in literary criticism, and training in hermeneutics. And only when a student has been trained properly, and I'll tell you, I have about 10 graduate students. Nearly all of them are Muslim. You'll never see them giving a lecture at the Islamic Center because no one cares about what they have to say. They'll never be invited to give a khutbah because they're too humble to put themselves out. But the amount of investment of time and energy that each one of these poor Muslim students has gone into these poor Muslim students just to get to the point to be able to read these books of Torah is enormous. And of course, it is very, they've done it the right way. They went and got their degrees, they got their grades, they competed with the best in the field, they got admitted to proper academic institutions, and they've done the hard work of getting excellent grades on their courses, of passing very tough methodology exams, passing very tough defenses, going on the market, getting a job, being peer reviewed, etc., etc., and then only to find a Muslim who does turas on their extra time, come in and completely marginalize them. Can you imagine the effect it has on a poor? It doesn't have an effect on me because I'm very well established, alhamdulillah. I don't need anything in my career, khalas. I'm looking, inshallah, towards retirement soon. But these people who are starting the career, can you imagine the devastating effect it has on them? When they find that anyone who just does Islam on the side, just completely marginalizes them and puts them and excludes them, and that's the type of thing we're talking about. I'm not here defending me. I'm defending my students and the students of the Sherman Jackson and the students of the Khaled Blankenship and the students of the Vincent Cornell and so on, and Ahmed Dalal and all these poor. At one point in our history, I could have gone into medicine. Gassin decided to go into medicine, right? And I could have gone into becoming an Islamic studies scholar. I had the grades and the scores to go into medicine. If I went into medicine, I could have had a very lucrative life. But I didn't make that choice. Now, it is simply morally not right that at the end, when it comes to the Muslim community, someone who made the decision to go into medicine ends up having the same authority or greater than the person who committed themselves to the field of Islamic knowledge. And of course, with me, alhamdulillah, it worked out fine. But there's a lot of other people it doesn't.
So are you students required to memorize the Quran and understand it?
You know, I memorized the Quran because my
No,
parents
I'm
made me
talking about you,
memorize the
well,
Quran.
students who are
I know.
studying
No,
Islam.
you know, today, memorizing Quran, technology has created computers that are hafiz. If it came to the hafiz,
There are millions of hafiz.
there are millions of hafiz.
Millions.
Yeah, we could honor the computer and do that. That's not the point.
Yes, please,
No,
there's a question.
comprehension. Comprehension. Nothing, our modern age, the true jihad is the jihad of the intellect, because modern world, borders have become so territorial, yeah, and territorial power is no longer correlates to territory. Technology and ideas is everything. And the true jihad is the jihad of ideas. And Muslims are completely absent. How many completely absent from the world of ideas? I could have understood this as a colonial phenomenon. And the world of colonial studies, we understand it as a colonial phenomenon. But you cannot understand it when Muslims had the opportunity to become an ingrown, homegrown phenomena within the West. Unfortunately, I think Islamophobia understood that very well and acted to neutralize it before it bore fruit. But that's how I started my talk.
Okay, great.
You have your hands up. I'm
Yes.
sorry.
Thank you.
Dr. Abou El Fadl, thank you very much for your time and sharing your ideas with us. I see the value of supporting academics, and I see the value of supporting scholars and their role in engaging other academics and schools of thought. What are the practical mechanisms, in your opinion, that their thought and their philosophy and what they have learned is going to trickle down to our children and grandchildren and the mosques and the Islamic schools and the community? How do you see the mechanism?
Yeah, this is really good, Grosha. I mean, there are layers of things I think are really important. First, if I am given a sense of priorities, because the first priority is to create, and I'm not even talking about supporting institutions that already, or a medium for people who are already established in academia, because it takes a lot of time. Credibility is worth a lot. And to invest in those who have credibility is an extremely valuable asset. First, to coordinate between those who already have established a credibility in the academia, to create methods by which they can coordinate with activists so we can respond to the first danger on all of our children, and that's Islamophobia. I would like to see Muslims invest in, and by the way, I don't know, it's not on the screen. I really want you to go on that site. It's called
Islamophobia.
We have it on the screen.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I just don't have it on there.
If you can look, when we're done, if you guys can look on the screen, what the Islamophobes did, which was quite brilliant, they created a fund where, or a number of funds, but the central pot of money, where basically the people who managed that fund would funnel the money or support and finance various projects that ultimately came together in the production of the Islamophobia industry. And so the first priority, in my view, is responding to that. In putting together media experts with communication experts, with marketing experts, with academic experts in how do we respond to Islamophobia. Because I'll tell you, the biggest risk for our children, our college kids are normally divided into two groups. Those who find a sense of affiliation in the MSA, and then, you know, whatever, and that's not the majority. And the majority are Muslims who are embarrassed about being Muslim, and they're embarrassed about being Muslim because of the Islamophobia industry, which is extremely strong on academic campuses. And this is the thing we really don't realize. Islamophobia did not focus on reaching mosques or Islamic centers because they knew that that's not where they're going to be the most impactful. Islamophobia focused on reaching university campuses. There is no university campus, including UCLA, that is not under siege by Islamophobes. We cannot even organize any event without the Islamophobes. I actually cannot teach even a course without Islamophobes monitoring my course, by the way, and writing reports on it. We even reached the point that when I got too effective, they took out an ad in the New York Times that was half a page against, I mean, how much does an ad in half a page in the New York Times cost? And they took out another ad in the Daily Bruin, and then they started, so that's the first priority. The second priority, the second, is that we don't realize, I have a colleague, she wouldn't be happy that I name her, but I don't care. Asma Saeed, who teaches a course at UCLA that on Islam in the West. It has 150 students. Now, a lot of the 150 students that take Islam in the West are Muslims. A lot of our alienated children, not the MSA kids, but those who are embarrassed to be Muslims, when they go to college, they don't major in Islamic studies, but they'll go take a course on Introduction to Islam, Introduction to Quran, Life of the Prophet, things like that. When they have a teacher that respects the Islamic tradition, it's a completely different. When I was an undergraduate at Yale, I took a course on Introduction to Islam taught by someone who was not very respectful towards Islam. I had, in my class I took, I had several Muslims who were taking the class with me. By the end of the class, my two Muslim friends no longer wanted to be Muslim. Because of what we learned, the way the class was taught completely made you feel that being Muslim is stupid.
Did you get a good grade in that course?
I got an A. but you know, it was taught by. But that, as you know, anyway. But what? So that's one issue is it reaches our children through our undergraduate teaching, and undergraduate teaching is so important. Not maybe law professors, because you get more advanced students, but the professors who teach our undergraduates. Third, and I know, well, I'll shut up after this. The third, the trickle-down effect. The first thing that our children, you know, they show attitude to their mom and dad, right? They answer back, so on, but when they go to college, what they always look for is an example of the intelligent Muslim. In other words, a Muslim that they think knows what they're talking about, is intellectually sophisticated and at the same time respectful. I cannot tell you the impact that it has on our kids when they find an accomplished Muslim who is openly a devout Muslim. Not a Muslim that say, oh yeah, I used to be Muslim, but a Muslim says, yes, I'm a Muslim professor. And do you believe in Islam? Of course, I do. So what? And they're not embarrassed. And they're a professor of political science, or a professor of sociology, or a professor of anthropology. The intellectual, psychological impact upon this, and this is why, although I'm a law professor, I have a whole bunch of undergraduates that just follow me around just because they think it's cool that there's a Muslim law professor. They'll never take a course with me, and I don't teach undergraduate courses, but they just want the example of a law professor who's a Muslim and who's proud of being a Muslim. And they might show attitude and they'll tell me things that they don't tell their parents. So, you know, they'll go fight with their parents about silly things, but then they'll listen to me. They'll come and talk to me about it. Because it's cool to talk to a law professor. It's not cool to talk to your mother and father about whatever. It has an enormous impact upon our kids, no question. And this is part of our engagement with civic society, realizing we don't exist in a ghetto. It's either we control the public discourse about Islam, or it will be controlled for us. One final point. And once, and Allah yarhamu Marhat, who used to repeat this story, because I was with him, we once asked John Esposito, why is he so interested in speaking for Islam, and it was Allah yarhamu Maher was asked, and I was just standing there, and I remember the story Maher used to repeat all the time, and I also what struck with me is that Esposito said, the reason I speak for Islam and defend it is because you guys won't. Because you guys won't.
You guys won't.
Meaning, and I was a student, I was an undergraduate student at the time, and it struck me. I mean by you guys, later on I asked this Biru, I said I meant you guys as Muslim academics. Meaning you Muslims don't go into academia and you won't do it. It just struck with me. Now this was in the 80s. And I thought at the time I heard it, oh, by the time I grow up, it will be completely different. Little did I know that, but the time I grew up, it would become much worse. No. Okay, so I'll show.
Well, no, I think there was just one more question, but we need to break for Maghrib and then dinner, right?
Yeah, because
it's getting
actually,
late.
if you are fasting, it's time for breaking your fast.